My name's Jorb. I love film, and I took all of those photos with this, a Contax T2. It's been my trusty companion from Berlin to Iceland, all the way back here to the mean streets of Des Moines. It is a premium 35mm point and shoot, and tons of people would claim that it's the best compact point and shoot you can get, and that reputation has sent those prices sky high. But you probably already knew that. You've already watched 10 or 20 videos about the Contax T2. You know it's expensive. People have blamed whichever genre they can remember. You know, maybe 5 of those people told you the lens was great and that's why you should buy it. And most of those videos turn out to just be a photo walk. I'm generalizing, but all I'm trying to say is most of the content you see on the Contax T2 and cameras in general really isn't the sort of thing I'm interested in watching, so I'm going to make something different. I'm going to make a video I would want to watch. And kind of more importantly, I think most people talking about the T2 are, well, for one, getting some details wrong, but 2, ignoring what I think really does set it apart. So I'm going to show you hands-on with the camera, explain how it controls, connect those controls, those features to actual results, talk about how I bought this broken, fixed it myself to save a bunch of money, and also compare it to a bunch of other point and shoots, because best is really a relative term. It has to be better than other things. So cool. Subscribe if you aren't. Let's get started. There she is. Beautiful. I'm going to walk through all of the controls on the T2, which are pretty unique. They're pretty particular. And I'm going to show you example photos that have been accomplished, you know, considering one or multiple of these settings on here. Because really, you hear people praise the lens a lot. People talk about, you know, how sharp the Zeiss glass is and high contrast rendering and all that stuff. I don't think that matters nearly as much as the control of the thing. I think that is how you get your photos, you know what I mean? This is how you interact with this object. The way it controls is how you get to those photos. So I want the lens to be sharp, of course. That doesn't affect how I shoot the camera. It doesn't affect how I use the camera. I don't know if that's a contrarian take or not, but I'm much more interested in what a camera lets me do versus the end results of any individual moment, any individual scenario. And the T2 has a lot of unique, sleek, clever controls. How about specifically, what am I talking about? The Contax T2 has 2 controls that are combined in a way that seems sort of obvious, but isn't very common. So first and foremost, the power switch is also your focus control. You go from off to autofocus to infinity. All 3 of those are detents, like you slot into those options. And you have smooth control between the focal range beyond that, 0.7 to probably a little bit beyond 5 meters. Then you click back into infinity. Autofocus is fast. Autofocus is accurate. I have it in autofocus 90% of the time. I'm not even sure what photos I'll use as examples for stuff I took with autofocus because it's on constantly. But the option to manually focus is great for things like glass or things like reflections. I'm never confident that autofocus will get those right. Sometimes it might. I don't understand the tech specifically in the Contax T2 for autofocus. But if you're taking a shot out of a window through glass, it's easy to force infinity. Or if you're getting something in a reflection, you can estimate the distance from your subject to whatever the mirror, whatever's reflective, and then back to the camera. I honestly think that manual focus, that level of control, is a huge leg up over a lot of other point and shoots. And actually, one of the coolest things about it is there's a sort of digital rangefinder. As you adjust your manual focus, there will be an arrow or a dot. There'll be a red arrow pointing you to move further or closer away, and then a green dot when the manual focus setting matches what it's reading from autofocus. You can use that to pre-focus accurately instead of like estimating distance in a street scenario. Oh, I'm going to take a picture of somebody by that sign. Okay, you find the distance to the sign, and then you wait for your frame. Or something like a self-timer shot. You could focus on someone else in the group and make sure you have the distance right, then set the camera down with timer and run to join the rest of them. Or maybe the fence you're about to lean at by yourself, because that's the only example I have where I would have done that. Moving on, the aperture ring is also your flash control. You have regular flash and then sort of a pre-flash, a red eye reduction. It'll flash twice. Then the green 2.8 is auto, and then the rest of aperture priority all the way up to 16. So there's no auto flash. You need to know, you need to make the decision. Yes, I want flash. No, I don't want flash. I like that. It's very rare that I'll pull the camera out and not be sure if I want flash or not, instead of having to press menu a couple times to turn off auto, like it is on so many of the other premium point and shoots. People complain that 80s point and shoots don't save their settings, but this, because it's just a physical dial, the lens retracts and it keeps it on whatever setting you left it on. That to me like might seem kind of trivial, but if you're in a place where you need to keep flash off, compared to something you have to pull out and then press mode 2 or 3 times. This is a huge net gain in how fast the camera can be in your pocket, out of your pocket, and taking a photo. But the rest of these controls, it is aperture priority. From f4 to f16, you set the aperture, and given the lighting, that the camera's reading, it gives you a shutter speed. Great. That's only when you pick f4 to f16. But when you're on the auto exposure setting, the green f2.8, then it's full auto exposure. The camera decides the shutter speed and decides the aperture. And this is another thing that people sort of miss. People will say that because the 2.8 setting is also the auto exposure, you can't force the T2 to use 2.8. And even if you do have it on that setting, you don't know when it does use 2.8. That isn't really true. We have the program chart in the manual. So we can see that it's prioritizing a faster aperture, a wider aperture all the time. If 2.8 would get you an accurate exposure, the camera will use 2.8. And when 2.8 would auto expose, the camera prioritizes a shallow depth of field first. It'll leave the shutter speed as fast as it can go and close down the aperture until you get an accurate exposure. So it's using 2.8 whenever it can, according to what it considers to be an accurate exposure. But if you would rather prioritize that really, really shallow depth of field, the camera tells you when it's changed off of f2.8. In the viewfinder above the shutter speed, P will show up for program. That's letting you know it's changed off of something else. So at that point, even if you want 2.8 at the cost of, metered overexposure, or you would prefer a shallower depth of field, you can use the exposure compensation and overexpose and overexpose and overexpose until that P goes away, and then you know that you're using 2.8. I don't do that. I've never done that. I trust the auto exposure. I don't mind if the correct exposure is f4 or f5.6 or whatever. But that's a complaint I've heard multiple times, that because you can't force it to use 2.8, you never know when it does, and you're not getting the shallowest depth of field you could. You totally are getting it is prioritizing a wider aperture, and it does tell you when it is or isn't using 2.8. This section's been long. I've been talking about the aperture ring for a long time, but you guys are smart. You know what manual aperture lets you do, and you know when you would want to use it. I mentioned the exposure compensation dial. Exposure compensation lets you over or underexpose relative to what the camera's reading as a proper exposure on the light meter. You can use it in the sort of like exposure compensation way. Say the subject of your scene is backlit. So when the light meter reads the whole scene, it will underexpose your subject. I'll use my thumb, push and turn, overexpose by one stop. Or front lighting, the opposite. If there's a spotlight on your subject and the rest of the scene is pitch black, you can underexpose and roll it all the way to -1 or -1.5. So whichever way you want to adjust the auto reading, you want to bias for the highlights, you want to bias for the shadows in a scene that's dynamic enough that you don't trust the light meter, or you have a preference one way or the other. One thing I use it for often, if I'm fine with a lot of shadows, or I think a lot of the shadow is the sort of composition I'm looking for, I'll check the shutter speed in the viewfinder and click towards underexposure one stop at a time until I make it to 1/60th, because that is what I think of as a handheld speed. Or beyond the sort of moment-to-moment exposure compensation stuff, you can use the exposure compensation dial to sort of offset from the light meter's reading to shoot at a different DX code. Maybe you are developing at home and you're going to push a roll. You can underexpose by 2 stops, and that roll of 400 speed film can be pushed all the way to 16. Or overexposing Portrait 400 by 1 stop is how you get the sort of film look, creaming pastels, whatever people say. You can do that with the exposure compensation dial. You can set it and forget it as an offset of whatever the DX code is. I didn't mention the obvious stuff. There's a self-timer. And of course, a half press to lock focus and lock exposure. I think that's everything for control. And another misconception I'd like to talk about. There's this idea, this pervasive idea, that old point and shoots are impossible to fix or it's insanely expensive to get fixed by a professional. That isn't totally true. A lot of, especially popular cameras, are well documented if they have issues. If people like them, they'll want to keep them running. And this is the sort of thing where passionate people are on the internet talking about it. Tons of cameras, especially popular ones, especially like these point and shoots, right? They've been around long enough that any of the issues that are common in these mass manufactured things will have shown up and somebody else will have dealt with it. And if the T2 is an exception to that, it's an exception in the way that more people are fixing them, more people are talking about them. It's going to be talked about online. There's going to be a well-documented explanation of pretty much every common problem. The sun is really making me glow. This specific camera, I bought it broken on eBay for only $400. It was described as having overlapping frames, and that was an issue I looked for and I found documented in pretty great detail. by the extremely informative Away Repairers. It's like a blog, like a live journal blog, operated by a man who called me an obsessed idiot when I was asking for information. Regardless, he walks through a similar repair for a similar issue in extreme detail. But the main thing I took away, just like a lot of the analog synthesizers I repair on my main channel, Jorb Loves Gear, electrolytic capacitors get old and they leak, causing corrosion. They ruin boards. They add resistance where there shouldn't be resistance. It's a regular thing that goes bad. I'm saying it's not some forbidden knowledge, you know what I mean, that these are components that might go bad. It's not some forbidden knowledge to fix them. It's straightforward to find these components, straightforward to replace them. The big problem is they're stuck underneath. To get to these simple components, you have to desolder a really sensitive, really fragile, really easy to mess up flexible circuit board. So to avoid that, my caveman brain, my simpleton brain, I realized the sort of plastic lens cover piece had enough mounting holes that I could cut it in half and it would still land in the same place, register fine. So that's what I did. I avoided the risk of the more sensitive components by destroying something that seemed like it would be fine. That felt like such a bad idea. I didn't film it in case I ruined this camera and, you know, had nothing to show for it, but it turned out fine. So I have a few pictures, but not a detailed video or anything. If I end up with another one, I will take a good detailed video showing people how I did it and how they might be able to do it themselves. But it worked great. Screwed right back together. No issues with the lens cover. Soldering the capacitors in was easy, and I have a totally working T2 now for maybe like less than half off. And I know not everybody has the skills to do that. Troubleshooting and repair is something I've been able to do because I've been doing it for a long time. But I think a lot of people can. A lot of people can figure it out. A lot of people are smart enough to work towards it. And I say it not specifically to say you should do that exact same thing to your T2, but everything can be fixed or repaired, and you can learn more about everything you're interested in, and it might be enough to help you solve a problem and get something for less money. Anyway, knowing you can get this for less means you might see it in a different price range, which means you might be comparing it to potentially even more cameras. So why don't we compare it to even more cameras? If I or anybody else is going to tell you that this is the best, I think you need to compare it to other things, right? Best is really relative. And I have a ton of point and shoots. It's going to seem excessive, okay? My goal is twofold. One, I really want to find the perfect point and shoot. I want to find something that works for me in as many situations as possible and just have that and fix that and buy another one if it really breaks or whatever. And two, mostly to myself, but prove in general that these things that people say are so expensive, you can always find them cheaper. And all these things that people say once they break, they'll never be fixed. I want to keep fixing them. So everything you're going to see, I bought broken or at least untested. And I have since got it working myself. And they're all going to get a video like the T2. So if you're curious about any of these other ones, subscribe and eventually it'll get its own video. But I'm rambling. Let me get this framed up. So I'm just going to compare this head-to-head with a bunch of other point and shoots. These are two other things people often cite as like the best thing you can get. This is the Olympus Stylus Epic, also known as the Mu2, the Yashica T4. I'm sure it has some other names. I consider these two really similar to each other, and I find myself choosing them in pretty much the same situation. So to save some time, I'm going to talk about them together. They all pretty much have the same focal length, 38, 35, 35. You're not going to notice that difference. Both of these can do all the way up to f2.8, but the T4 only goes to 3.5. I don't think that matters very much at all. That's very wide on all three of them. In most of the situations you're going to want to use these in, you probably don't need 2.8 realistically. When do I choose these over the T2? Mostly when I'm just grabbing something like on the way out the door. I just like having a diary camera, sort of. I like having something with me where I'm doing a regular thing that I might want a few pictures of. These I'm way more likely to grab because they're less expensive, because they're less precious. And if I want to replace them or if I drop them, I won't, be horrified like I would be with the T2. These are far less feature-rich than the T2. You're giving up aperture priority. You're giving up exposure compensation. You can control flash on both of these, and they have a self-timer. So in general, if what I'm going to do is something where I'm going to be focused on getting good pictures, and it needs to be, a pocket-sized camera, the T2 is what's going to win. And if I'm just grabbing something on the way out, I can still trust these to get great images. I just am probably less focused on taking the pictures, I hope that made sense. Next, this is also pretty close. This is the Konica Big Mini F. Can I get this framed well? Pretty similar to all the other Big Minis or the A4. And really, in my experience, I treat it really similarly to the T4 and the Mu2. So really, everything I just said about just grabbing a diary camera or, having something that's a little less precious, but it does have a few advantages. You do have exposure compensation here. Hope that's in focus. You have flash off and then plus or minus 1.5. So not something I would use to sort of overwrite the DX code, to over-underexpose an entire roll like you can on the T2. But for front-lit or backlit scenarios, this can totally cover that. Both f2.8, 35mm versus 38. Again, not a significant difference. But this does do something better. If I'm only going to be shooting with flash, if I know for sure it's all going to be shots in a bar or we're out after dark or whatever, if I know I'm just going to shoot flash photography, this does a better job. I don't have specifics, and I looked in both manuals for specifics. I can't really. It says there's a variable flash on the Big Mini, but I don't know more than that. I don't know if it's a thyristor thing or if it's reading the distance and adjusting flash power. Whatever it's doing, it's willing to open up to a wider aperture, and flash photos turn out way less harsh. I'm really, really impressed with the flash photography coming out of the Big Mini. Not that T2 is bad or I wouldn't use it for flash, but if I'm only going to use flash, I've consistently had better luck with the Big Mini F. Other than that, same thing as before. This is getting grabbed as a diary camera because it's less delicate and less precious. And the T2 is what I grab when I'm really going to be locked into shooting photos. Somewhat confusingly, this is the Olympus XA, the original one, not the 2 or the 4 or whatever else there is. It might seem like a different comparison, but they're closer than you think. Aperture priority is available on both. But beyond that, this is a manual focus rangefinder, and it has to be aperture priority. There is no full auto mode. I choose this in a pretty specific scenario. I choose this when I'm going to be outside pretty much all day. I don't like the flash. It makes it too bulky, and I haven't really liked the results I've gotten with flash from the XA. But this is when I want to be slowly, methodically locked in to the whole process. I want to choose my whole aperture. I want to manually focus. It's a different mood to I want the photos to be good. I don't know if that makes sense or not. This does have exposure compensation, but it is just like a backlight compensation. Yeah, it doesn't help to go over how different these are. It is. I'm merely bringing it out to say sometimes I choose this over the T2. Sometimes I would rather hold this up, find my focus, choose my aperture, and go. Maybe a hike, maybe a day on the beach. This is the sort of I would rather have the XA, I think. Great. That might have felt different. And last, and probably the toughest competition here, this is the Fuji Class W. It's actually, I would open the lens, but it doesn't have batteries in it right now. This is very fully featured, more so than the T2, really. And I know it's not most of what we've been talking about, but this is a wider lens. This is a 28mm instead of a 38. That's a big enough difference that you will notice. And if I really want a wide angle, sometimes if I'm going to be in a crowd or I know I'm going to be indoors a lot of the time, I'll prefer a wider angle just to have. Plus, this has a leg up in its exposure compensation is separate from its manual ISO settings. Its aperture setting is separate from its flash setting. So if you want to have independent control of those, you totally can, especially the exposure compensation being separate to the ISO. It's very, very nice to be able to be pushing film and still adjust per shot, per scene. So I end up choosing this in situations where I really want the wide angle more, or I'm pushing film. Plus, I find this is more accurate in focus, more accurate in exposure. It's closer to a spot meter, I guess you can say. But it's slower. The T2 is faster. It's kind of hard to explain, and it's really getting into specifics about the Class W and staying away from the T2. And I really don't want to talk about cameras other than the T2 so much, but there's way more of a delay between half press to find your focus, committing to taking a photo. It's like a whole second longer than how long it takes on the T2. Maybe that's because it's getting a more accurate exposure, more accurate focus, whatever, but it's something that I've really, really started to notice. I wouldn't say that I'd necessarily choose one or the other because of that, but it is just something worth noting. The T2 feels a lot faster. But generally, I think of these at the same time. I'm going somewhere. I want the photos really to be good. I'm going to want some flexibility in my control over the photos. And then it comes down to, is a wider angle going to work better? Am I going to be pushing film? So this gets picked for concerts. This gets picked for concerts a little bit more than the T2 does because I find myself pushing film when I'm going to be in the dark like that. Very, very close to each other in when I would choose them, but it really comes down to wide angle and the additional control for when I decide the class is what I'm going to take. That's really it, and I really probably could have saved this whole section by saying I choose the T2 over all of those when I really, really, really need the photos to be good, and to that end, I want more control. More control helps me take better photos in more situations, and that's probably true for anybody. But that's when I think anybody would choose the T2. This isn't something I want in my pocket every day, but it is something I want at a wedding, on a trip, something important, something I really want to make sure I get good photos from. Something where I value a good photo enough to risk dropping this a few times is really what I'm saying. That is it for the comparisons. I was just going to conclude here, but I think I'd rather talk to the camera. So, properly, in conclusion, do I think the Contax T2, this lovely, lovely object, is the best point-and-shoot money can buy? I don't really think it's the best. I think it does take fantastic photos. I think the control options are amazing, and it's definitely too expensive. But realistically, is there a type of person with a type of use case that will take the T2 and the features it offers you, the control it offers you, and use that to take better photos than they would with another point and shoot? I do think that's true. I think there are a lot of people that would find this to be a better choice in their use case than other stuff. I don't necessarily think that's me. Most of the time, if I want to point and shoot, I want to throw it in my pocket. I don't want to be worried about it. For lack of a better phrasing, I don't want to be that engaged with the photography if I'm just grabbing a point and shoot, or it's an environment or an event where I don't want to be. I want to be focused on something else. And if I see an opportunity for a good photo, then I'll pull out the camera and do it. If something's going to be around my neck and I'm focused on taking photos, realistically, I'm taking an SLR before I'm thinking about a point and shoot. And even still, if it's a place where I don't want to bring an SLR or I can't bring an SLR and I want to be engaged with the sort of photo taking process, I've had better results and I prefer the control on my Class W. So if you're thinking about a camera that's this expensive, maybe look into the Class series as well, the S and the W and the original. But that's really it. I'm fascinated by this. I'm fascinated that people are fascinated by it. I'm fascinated that it's garnering so much attention this far, after it originally came out. And I'm pleased by that. I like when people are interested in tools for art. That is my whole shtick. I'm fascinated by it endlessly. So there you go. My name's Jorb. I love film. I love the Contax T2. Especially if you made it to the end, thank you. I showed you a bunch of cameras in this. If there's one specifically you want me to talk about, comment. You'll probably be the only comment down there. That's it. Thanks for watching. Cheers and so long.